What if everything you thought you knew about a billionaire was wrong? Here's a shocking fact to start with. A former U.S. president was just told by a judge that his arguments were frivolous, baseless, and unworthy at the court's time. And now his assets are being lined up for seizure. Not fined, not warned, taken. So when courts reach this stage, it usually means one thing. The system believes the money is real, the debt is real, and the excuses are over. This isn't a rumor or a political talking point. This is about Donald Trump, his business empire, and a legal ruling so brutal that even veteran legal analysts were stunned by its tone. The buildings that shaped skylines, properties tied to his identity, all suddenly vulnerable because a judge rejected his last-ditch claims to stop the process. So how did it get this far? Why did the judge shut him down so completely? And what does it say when the courts and the financial system both say no at the same time? Stay with me, because the next 10 reasons explain exactly why this moment could change everything. Here's the part many people miss, and it's critical to understanding why the judge shut Trump down so decisively. This was not a fresh case. This was not a political ambush. The court had already ruled, after a full trial, that Donald Trump committed persistent and repeated fraud over many years. Witnesses testified, documents were reviewed, defenses were heard, and the verdict was clear. When the judge later rejected Trump's emergency motions, she wasn't deciding guilt all over again. She was simply enforcing a judgment that already existed. Trump's legal team tried to argue as if the court was rushing or acting unfairly. But the judge made one thing unmistakably clear. This outcome was predictable. The ruling didn't come out of nowhere. It was the natural consequence of losing a civil fraud case involving hundreds of millions of dollars. In the judge's view, calling enforcement unconstitutional or irreparable harm wasn't just wrong, it ignored how civil law actually works. Once a judgment is entered, the clock starts ticking. Courts don't wait indefinitely just because the defendant doesn't like the result. This is why the judge's tone mattered so much. She wasn't patient anymore. She made it clear that Trump had every opportunity to avoid this moment by not committing fraud, by settling earlier, or by following standard procedures after losing. Instead, he chose delay, denial, and dramatic claims. The court saw through it. Final judgment means final authority, and once that line is crossed, the law shifts from debate to action. That's why asset seizure wasn't extreme, it was inevitable. If this breakdown helped you see the story more clearly, drop a comment telling us which reason shocked you most. We actually read them, and they shape future videos. We put real time, real research, and real effort into making these videos simple and honest. So if you value that, hit subscribe. It's just one click, but it makes a huge difference. And if you believe facts matter more than noise, stay with us, because the next reasons get even more revealing. This is where the situation quietly turned from legal trouble into a full-blown financial emergency. After losing the fraud case, Donald Trump had a clear legal path if he wanted to stop enforcement while appealing post a bond. That bond exists for one reason: to guarantee the money will still be there if the appeal fails. Courts don't just take someone's word for it, especially after a fraud ruling. No bond means no pause, and without a pause, the law moves forward. Trump's team argued that the bond amount was unfair, excessive, even impossible. But the judge wasn't persuaded, because this requirement isn't unique to Trump. It applies to everyone. If a defendant owes hundreds of millions, the bond reflects that reality. The court's position was simple and cold. Appeals are not free delay passes. You can challenge the ruling, but you don't get to freeze consequences unless you meet the legal standard. Claiming it's too hard doesn't change the rule. What made this especially damaging is what happened next. Trump's lawyers admitted they contacted dozens of bond companies and couldn't secure one willing to take the risk. That wasn't the court's failure. It was the market speaking. When private financial institutions refuse to back your assets after a fraud judgment, the court doesn't step in to save you. It steps aside and lets enforcement begin. At that moment, this stopped being about legal arguments and became about financial credibility. And once credibility collapses, the system doesn't slow down, it accelerates. If this explanation changed how you see this case, leave a comment with one word that describes your reaction. We read every single one. We spend hours breaking these stories down so they're clear, honest, and factual. So if you appreciate that effort, subscribe. It's just one click. And stay with us, because the next reason explains why even the financial world turned its back. This is where the story takes a turn that no amount of legal spin can fix. After being found liable for fraud, Donald Trump insisted that his properties were enormously valuable, valuable enough that seizing them would cause irreparable harm. But when it came time to prove that value in the real world, something remarkable happened. The market said no. Bond companies, insurers, and financial institutions whose entire business is assessing risk refused to accept Trump's properties at his claimed valuations. Not one, not a few dozens turned him down. The judge didn't see this as coincidence. In fact, she highlighted the irony at the heart of Trump's argument. He was found liable for fraud because he overstated asset values to banks and insurers for years. Now, he wanted those same kinds of institutions to trust those values enough to back a massive bond. They wouldn't. And from the court's perspective, that wasn't unfair. It was confirmation. If Trump's properties were truly worth what he had claimed for decades, securing a bond would have been routine. The refusal wasn't political. It was financial reality catching up. This is why the judge's rejection was so sharp. Courts don't exist in a vacuum. They understand how markets work. When every serious financial actor independently reaches the same conclusion that the risk is too high, judges pay attention. The ruling made it clear. Trump's inability to secure a bond wasn't proof the system was rigged against him. It was proof that his credibility had collapsed. And once credibility is gone, courts stop extending patience. At that point, enforcement isn't aggressive, it's logical. This wasn't just a legal loss. It was the moment the numbers stopped lying for him. If this part made you pause, comment with the word market, because this is where the story quietly turns. We put serious effort into breaking these moments down without noise or spin. So if that matters to you, subscribe. It's just one click. And don't go anywhere. The next reason explains why the judge said the damage was entirely self-inflicted. If this explanation helped you connect the dots, comment choices, because that's what this all comes down to. We put real effort into breaking these stories down with clarity. So if you value that, subscribe. It's just one click, but it keeps this channel going. Stay tuned, because the next reason explains why Trump's constitutional argument completely fell apart. This was one of Trump's most dramatic claims, that enforcing the judgment before his appeal was completely violated his constitutional right to due process. It sounds powerful, and it's designed to raise alarm. But the judge dismantled this argument with precision. Due process doesn't mean endless delay. It means you get notice, a fair hearing, and an opportunity to defend yourself, all of which Donald Trump received. In fact, the judge emphasized that Trump was given more than enough process, not less. The court explained something most people don't realize. New York's bond requirement exists to protect due process, not undermine it. When a defendant appeals a large judgment, the bond ensures that money will still be available if the appeal fails. Without it, defendants could drag cases out for years, move assets, and leave victims with nothing. The judge noted that this rule has been upheld repeatedly and applies to every defendant, no matter how powerful or famous. Trump wasn't being singled out. He was being treated exactly like anyone else who lost a massive civil case. This is where the argument truly collapsed. The judge made clear that Trump was free to appeal as much as he wanted. No one stopped him, but the Constitution does not guarantee a consequence-free appeal. Enforcement during appeal is normal when a bond isn't posted. Calling that unconstitutional wasn't just wrong. It showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how civil law works. Once the judge framed it this way, the claim lost all force. The system wasn't denying Trump his rights, it was preventing him from abusing them. And that distinction mattered more than any political rhetoric he could offer. If this cleared up the confusion around due process, common constitution, so we know this breakdown helped, we put serious effort into explaining complex legal issues in plain language. So if you appreciate that, subscribe. It's just one click. Don't move, because the next reason explains why the judge flat out rejected claims of political persecution. This was the argument Trump returned to again and again, that the entire case was a political hit job driven by enemies who wanted to destroy him. His lawyers claimed the enforcement action wasn't about law at all, but about politics, specifically targeting Donald Trump because of who he is. But the judge didn't just reject this claim. She treated it as dangerous nonsense when presented without evidence. Courts don't deal in vibes, slogans, or campaign narratives. They deal in proof. The judge laid out a reality Trump couldn't escape. The case was brought by Letitia James. Yes, but it was supported by years of investigation, documents, sworn testimony, and expert analysis. Trump had lawyers. He cross-examined witnesses. He presented defenses. He lost. Calling that outcome political after the fact didn't transform it into persecution. The judge emphasized that disagreement with a verdict is not evidence of bias, and that accusing the courts of corruption without proof is not a legal argument. It's as an attack on the justice system itself. What made this especially damaging was the judge's tone. She made it clear she had heard this argument before, repeatedly, and found it increasingly insulting to the integrity of the court, suggesting that judges, clerks, and entire legal institutions were conspiring against Trump. Wasn't just unsupported, it crossed a line. Courts have a responsibility to shut that down, because if every losing defendant could cry politics and halt enforcement, the law would collapse. And this is where the rhetoric finally backfired. And instead of helping Trump, it convinced the court he was acting in bad faith, trying to weaponize public outrage to escape accountability. And once a judge reaches that conclusion, the door closes fast. This is where the judge drew one of the clearest lines in the entire ruling. Trump's arguments, taken together, were essentially asking for special treatment, different rules because of who he is, what office he once held, and how big his public platform remains. But the court made it unmistakably clear. The law does not bend for status. Once Donald Trump stepped into a civil courtroom as a defendant, he stood there like any other person who had lost a fraud case, owing hundreds of millions of dollars. The judge emphasized that New York's enforcement rules are routine, well-established, and applied every day to defendants with far less power and visibility. If regular business owners lose civil judgments and fail to post bond, their assets are seized, no speeches, no headlines, no sympathy. Trump's fame didn't entitle him to delays, exemptions, or gentler enforcement. In fact, the court suggested the opposite. Allowing exceptions for powerful figures would undermine public trust and signal that justice operates on a sliding scale. That's not how courts survive legitimacy. This reasoning carried enormous weight. Judges are deeply aware that their rulings send messages beyond individual cases. In this one, The message was simple but profound. The rule of law only works if it applies equally. The court refused to create a carve-out for a former president because doing so would invite every wealthy, influential defendant to demand the same. That's why Trump's status worked against him, not for him. The judge wasn't interested in who he was, only in what the law required after a final judgment. And once that principle was firmly established, asset seizure became unavoidable. Equality before the law wasn't just cited, it was enforced. By the time this ruling came down, the judge wasn't just evaluating arguments, she was evaluating patterns. And the pattern was impossible to ignore. Over and over, Donald Trump used emergency motions of constitutional claims and political rhetoric not to correct legal errors, but to slow the clock. The judge made it clear that courts are not obligated to indulge tactics designed to delay accountability after a final judgment. Appeals are a right, but abusing procedure to stall enforcement is not. What mattered most here was intent. The judge noted that Trump's filings didn't introduce new facts, new law, or new evidence. Instead, they recycled arguments already rejected, repackaged with more dramatic language. That's a red flag in any courtroom. Judges expect good faith litigation, real disputes over real legal issues. When motions appear designed primarily to postpone consequences, courts are allowed to shut them down quickly. That's exactly what happened here. The judge wasn't confused. She wasn't undecided. She was done. This is why the ruling felt unusually sharp. The court essentially said the appeals process cannot be weaponized as a stalling mechanism. If that were allowed, wealthy defendants could drag cases out indefinitely while quietly moving assets out of reach. The bond requirement exists to stop that exact behavior. When Trump failed to post bond and then tried to block enforcement anyway, the judge interpreted it as an attempt to delay what the law had already decided. Once that conclusion was reached, patience evaporated. The court shifted from listening to acting, and when a judge believes a defendant is no longer litigating in good faith, the legal system stops negotiating and starts enforcing fast. If this helped clear up a major misconception, comment collection so others don't miss this point. We put serious effort into explaining what headlines often distort. So if you value that, subscribe. It's just one click. And stay with us, because the final reason explains why this ruling sends a message far beyond Trump himself. This final reason goes beyond Trump himself and explains why this moment matters so much. The judge wasn't just resolving a dispute with Donald Trump, she was reinforcing a boundary. For years, Trump's strategy relied on one assumption, that power and publicity and pressure could bend institutions until consequences disappear. This ruling made it clear that assumption no longer works. When courts enforce judgments, even against the most powerful figures in the country, they're sending a signal that the system still functions, even under stress. The judge's language mattered because judges are usually restrained, careful, and diplomatic. Here, she was direct. She rejected arguments not just as wrong, but as bad faith. That tone wasn't emotional, it was deliberate. It told future defendants that the courtroom is not a political stage, and legal procedures are not tools for performance or delay. If you lose, you comply. If you appeal, you follow the rules. If you don't, enforcement follows. That clarity is essential for the rule of law to survive moments like this. This is why legal experts call the ruling a watershed moment. It strips away the illusion that wealth or influence creates immunity. It reassures ordinary citizens that fraud still has consequences and that courts will not blink simply because a defendant is famous or polarizing. Whether people love Trump or hate him is irrelevant to the law, and that's the point. The system either applies equally or it collapses. By allowing asset seizure to move forward, the judge chose principle over pressure. And that decision will echo far beyond this one case, shaping how powerful defendants are treated for years to come. If you think this moment says something bigger about accountability, drop a comment with one word that sums it up for you. We put real effort into cutting through noise and explaining what actually matters. So if you value that, subscribe. It's just one click. And thank you for watching all the way through. That support keeps this channel alive.